Good evening, first of all.
Good evening.
And welcome. Last week, we read about the 10 plagues, but actually, we read about the 7 plagues, because the plagues were divided in the Torah into 2 segments. Last week's Torah reading was about the first 7 plagues, and this week's Torah reading is about the last 3. Let me mute everyone. Let's go through the first 7 quickly, and then we'll do the last 3. The first one was the Nile River turned into blood. The second one is the Nile River produced a swarm of frogs. The third one was the earth turned into lice. The fourth one was a mixture of wild animals terrorized the country. The next one was a plague that killed animals. The next one was boils that afflicted the bodies of the Egyptians. And the last one, the 7th that we read last week, was hail. Hail with fire in it. Now, if we look at all these 7 plagues, we notice that there's a progression. In the beginning, the plagues were annoyances. They annoyed the people. Then it became a little bit more serious. The animals were all killed. Not all of them, but the majority of them were killed. And then it got more serious with the bodies of the Egyptians began to suffer, the boils. So God was now going from annoying them to harming their property to harming their bodies. And then the last of the 7 plagues, the hail, was not only destructive of the crops, but it also killed people. Anyone who stayed outside was killed. So things were getting a little bit more serious. And now we pick up the last 3 plagues. The last 3 are locusts. The locusts covered the entire land and devoured all the crops that were left after the hail. The next one was plague of darkness. And then the last plague was the plague of the firstborn. The firstborn Egyptians of every family died. So we can see how this 8th plague was worse than any of the preceding plagues, because when the crops are all devoured, there's starvation, mass starvation. You don't have any crops. Number 2, it covered the entire land. All the other plagues were localized and were temporary, but when you eat up all the food, it's not temporary, it's permanent. Who knows how many people would die of hunger. The last plague is the worst of all, where all firstborn in every household died. But the 9th plague is problematic. The 9th plague is darkness. Now, no one likes to sit in the dark. It's frightening, psychologically unsettling, but it doesn't seem to be as an improvement or a lack of more pain and suffering than the other plagues before them. It's an annoyance to sit in the dark. But why was the plague of darkness the 9th plague? That's a question that commentators raise. And one answer given by Rashi, the most important Bible commentator, who lived 900 years ago, approximately. So he says, and he quotes earlier sources, that there were 2 reasons for this plague. One reason was there were many Jews in Egypt who didn't want to go out of Egypt. They did not want to be liberated. They wanted to remain in Egypt. And they all died out in the plague of darkness and were buried then. God did not want the Egyptians should see that the Jews were also suffering. So he made this happen during a plague of darkness, so the Egyptians never discovered the fact that they were not the only ones who were suffering, but the Israelites were also suffering. That's one explanation. Another explanation is God told Moses to tell the people that you should borrow the wealth of Egypt, borrow the silver, the gold, the clothing. But you know what? If you're going to go asking them, they're going to say, we don't have anything. We don't have any silver or gold. So during this plague of darkness, the Israelites rummaged through all the houses of the Egyptians and saw where they kept all their valuables. They didn't take a thing. That would be stealing, but they witnessed everything. So when the Egyptians said, oh, we don't have anything, the Israelites said, well, we were in your house during the plague of darkness and we saw which drawer you keep your stuff. Those are the two explanations given. But I'd like to go a little bit deeper into it. That these last three plagues were in a sequence. And the darkness plague was in many ways worse than any of the plagues before. Because this eighth plague, the one of locusts, was pervasive. It covered the whole land. Everything was covered. It was nothing, there was no place to escape. When you're a human being, human beings are affected more by psychological trauma than they are by physical pain. I just want to share a little experiment that a scientist did about 40 years ago, and he asked me whether it was ethical or not. I told him no, it wasn't ethical, but it was after the fact. This experiment was, they wanted to see the effect of psychological trauma on a person's ability to think clearly. So what they did is but how do you subject someone to psychological trauma? You can't say to a volunteer, we're going to subject you to, it's not going to work. So what they did is they had to trick them into something. This is what they did. They brought a group of students who were volunteers for experiments. They didn't know what they were volunteering for, they just were volunteering for different experiments. And they brought them into a room and they had to fill out some type of a test. They had to put some ink, the different questions, and they had to answer all the questions. And then they were taken into another room where they would have to answer mathematical questions, simple arithmetic questions, and to see how fast they can do it. Now, what happened was, the scientist who was doing this experiment, after the group number one, there were two groups that were subjected to these two tests. Group number one, after they finished punching, whether it was punching the holes or filling in with a pencil or whatever it was, he comes into the room and he looks at he collects their test. He says, what did you do here? You did it all wrong. You messed up. You messed up the entire experiment. You shouldn't have done it this way. You should have done it a different way. And he made them feel very uncomfortable by design. Then he says, okay, go to the other room for the next experiment. And they go to the next room and they start to work on answering the questions, the mathematical questions. And he walks into the room, ostensibly to find something that he needed. And they look up and they see him. And of course, looking at him made them feel uncomfortable. And then the rate of how they answered the questions went downhill. It went down. Their minds weren't thinking clearly. The control group were not embarrassed. He didn't berate them. And even though he interrupted them, it didn't affect the way they answered. So he was able to prove, and it was published in the scientific journal, that trauma, because when you do it with physical pain, it doesn't work. Human beings could endure physical pain, and it won't affect the way they think. They can still be as smart. Some of the most brilliant people went through a tremendous amount of physical pain and suffering, and it didn't detract from their ability to think. But when you subject someone to emotional pain, unlike animals, when they did experiment with rats, physical pain didn't affect the rats, but not humans. What I'm saying is the first 7 plagues were mostly plagues to hurt them, annoy them, physically abuse them, even kill them. But the last three plagues were psychological, in addition to the physical part of it. When the locusts covered the whole land, it left no room for them. They felt that they can't escape because it was so pervasive. When something is localized, you could always escape it. There's always a place where you can go, where you're immune to what's going on. But if it pervades the whole area, you couldn't escape. But then you can go inside your home. If the outside, if your public experience is painful, a person, let's say, is rejected by society, they can find solace and comfort in their own home. So what do? They go into their own homes and it's pitch dark. There was zero ability to even get a little comfort from being in their own home. That was psychologically very, very painful and devastating. But then a person could think to himself, right now I'm having this pain, but I have a future. Now, in those days especially, and this is true in every period, every human being wants mortality. We can't have it, but that's what we would like. Well, one way of having mortality is to have a child, a firstborn child, that takes over and inherits your legacy and continues your life. And in those days especially, the firstborn were the priests. They were the ones who took over from their fathers. And what happens, the next plague is they don't have any future either. Their firstborn are destroyed. Their whole future is destroyed. So there's no room for any comfort, because either you get comfort from the outside, from the inside, or from the future. And they lost all those three. So in that sense, the last three plagues were the most devastating of all. Another way of looking at the last three plagues: what is it about being in exile? The Egyptian experience was bondage, but they were in exile. They were not free people. The Jewish people are experiencing now exile. We don't have the temple in Jerusalem, and we're waiting every day and praying for the coming of Mashiach, the Messiah that will take us out of exile and bring peace to the world, and peace and love and tranquility and all the good things. But what are the conditions of exile? One definition of exile is that you are driven away from your land. That's a geographic form of exile. But there's a deeper, more profound type of exile when you're driven away from your own ability to be who you are. You can't be yourself. You're subject to someone else. Someone else defines you. You can't define yourself. That's what a slave is. A slave has no identity. His whole identity is his master's identity. When you are a subject of some other force, you lose your own identity. And why do you lose your identity? Because even if you're not a slave, but you don't see reality, you're living in a false reality. That's what exile is. Living in a false reality. The first type of false reality is where you can't see beneath the surface. When you look at life the way it is and you take things at face value, you don't see the deeper underlying meaning of life. When you look at a person and you only see their the facade, you don't see what's inside. You're living in a false world. It's not the true world, but that's the reality of being in an exile state, that you can't see what's going on beneath the surface. You only see the superficial. You only see the cover, not what's beneath the cover. That's what the plague of locusts was. The Torah describes it as that it covered the entire surface of the earth. You couldn't see anything. Everything is covered up. That's symbolically, that means your whole ability to experience reality is covered up, is limited, is eclipsed. that's one aspect of being in exile. Then the plague of darkness is where it says that one could not see his brother, where you can't really see the other person. You don't really recognize the other individual. Why do people have hatred towards others? Why do people fight and kill? And it all starts with a lack of recognition of the value of the other person. You have no sense of value. And then the third thing is, even if you do have some sense of reality, you're in touch with the truth, it doesn't last. There's no continuity. And that's what the last plague, the plague of the firstborn, symbolizes, the lack of continuity. That even when you have some positive experience, it's fleeting, it doesn't last. Those are the three last plagues. Now, I mentioned before that during the plague of darkness, the Jews who didn't want to leave Egypt all perished during that time. Why did they perish? Because they didn't want to leave Egypt. But the question is, not everyone who left Egypt was really very righteous. There were idol worshippers who left Egypt. Everyone left. Our sages tell us that when the Jews were in Egypt, they descended into 49 levels of impurity. There's only 50 levels. If they had gone down to the 50th level, they wouldn't have been redeemed. But they had at least, they remember that they were Jews, that they had an identity. They didn't change their names. They didn't change their language. They didn't change their dress. That means they said, we are different. We don't know why we're different. We don't know what it's all about. But they had some sense of identity. The ones who didn't want to leave Egypt didn't have that sense of identity. And they couldn't leave because they became so absorbed in the culture of Egypt, the idolatrous culture of Egypt, that they couldn't really, you can't liberate someone who doesn't know who they are. And they were not salvageable. They were not capable of being saved. So they had no choice. They had to stay in Egypt. And they perished in Egypt. Now, why were the ones who were idol worshippers, why were they redeemed from Egypt? Because the way Moses spoke to Pharaoh, what does Moses tell Pharaoh? God has told me to tell you to let the people go. And how does he refer to the people? B'ni b'chori Yisrael, my firstborn Israel. My firstborn child, that God refers to the people as his children. That means the whole idea of the Exodus was for the people to be part of God's family, God's children. People who didn't want to be God's child didn't make it. The only reason you would be redeemed, even though you misbehave, is because you're still a child. No parent will, well, I can't say no parent, but no good parent will reject a child because they don't behave properly. It's still your child. You still have to love that child. As painful as it may be, that's what being a parent is all about. So when God says to the people, you are my firstborn child, even if they were not faithful to God, God would still redeem them. But if you didn't want to be called a child of God, if you wanted to reject that status of being God's child, then you had nothing redeeming about you. However, that all lasted until the Torah was given at Mount Sinai. At Mount Sinai, where God chose the Jewish people, our sages tell us we have no choice anymore. The Jewish people cannot escape being Jewish. They could try, but it won't work. No matter how far a Jew goes away from God, from wanting to even be connected to God or even denying God's existence, our belief is that every Jewish person will be part of the final redemption. No one will be left behind. Because even if you don't want to be a child, God says, I'm choosing you anyhow. You don't have a choice in this matter. I chose you, no matter how bad you are. Because you have a special mission in this world, and I chose you for that mission. If you do it, fine. If you don't do it, it won't be good for you, but you're still going to be mine. I can never reject you. Going back to the 10 plagues, they're divided into 7 and 3. What's the significance of those two numbers? So in the teachings of Kabbalah, of Jewish mysticism, we're taught that the human being possesses 10 faculties, 7 emotional and 3 intellectual. For example, the emotional traits, love and kindness is one trait. Fear, hatred, rejection are another trait. And then there are a total of 7 emotional traits. And then there are 3 intellectual. So the first 7, God was attacking the emotional state of the Egyptian culture. Because we have 2 identities. A human being is a composite of 2 identities. We have a godly soul and an animal soul. The godly soul is primarily governed by its intellect. Its bases, its emotions, its desires, its attachments to things based on pure intellect. The animal soul is the reverse. The animal soul bases itself on its own feelings, on its own emotions, like an animal. Animals are very smart. Some of them are much smarter than humans. But an animal doesn't start with intellect. An animal starts with its emotions, its desires, its needs. An animal needs to eat, so it will hunt. But it needs intelligence to be able to hunt. Animals are very clever. But the intellect is there to serve their emotions, to serve their needs, to serve their wants. So it starts off with emotions. And the same thing is true with people who are evil. The Egyptians were evil people. They were governed primarily by their emotions, not by their philosophy. The philosophy comes later. The evil, the Nazis or the communists wreaked such havoc on the world, and the Jewish people in particular. They didn't start with intellect. They didn't come sit down one day and decide, we're going to create a philosophy, and based on that philosophy, we're going to do the things we do. They were power-hungry people. These were people, evil people, who hated certain segments of society, and they developed a philosophy around that hatred. That's like an animal. An animal does it, that's fine. That's the way animals are created. But when a human being acts that way, then that becomes evil. So the first attack against the Egyptian evil had to attack their emotions, had to attack their emotional makeup, because that's really what governs them, their emotions. Later, after you deal with their emotions, you have to also deal with their mindset, with their philosophy, with their ideology. But first comes the attack on their emotions. Later on in the weekly Torah portion, it speaks about how God commanded the Jewish people to prepare for the Exodus by eating matzah, sprinkling blood of a lamb on the doorposts. They had to do several different things as they were preparing to leave Egypt. Why do they have to do these things? Why couldn't God just take them out? So our sages tell us, because God wanted them to earn their freedom. The people were not really capable of doing anything as slaves. They couldn't practice their own religion as such. They were just, the only thing they had redeeming was that they didn't change their identity, but that there's nothing really tangible that they really did. When you free someone from prison, and you free them only because, for no good reason, they didn't really do anything to deserve it, you never feel that you are truly free. You never really appreciate the liberation because you didn't deserve it. Human beings can't feel satisfied with anything that they get without effort. Yes, there are people who don't like to work. There are lazy people who sit around and do nothing. They're not happy people. They can't be happy because a human being, there's a verse in the book of Job, a human being was created to toil. People were created to be active. And you could be active physically, you could be active intellectually, but you have to be active. You can't just sit back and enjoy life by doing nothing. And the Talmud refers to it as shameful bread. A beggar who doesn't really earn his bread is embarrassed because they didn't earn what they're getting. If God would have just taken the people out of Egypt without earning anything, without doing anything to earn it, they would have felt we really didn't leave Egypt. We were not really liberated because we're nobodies. We don't stand for anything. If you don't stand for anything, your life is incomplete. Your life is not a wholesome life. So God says, I'm going to give them a mitzvah, a spiritual action. They'll bring this paschal offering, this lamb. They'll be circumcised. The men will be circumcised, and that will give them a virtue for which they could say, we did something, because taking a lamb was not safe, because that was one of the things that the Egyptians worshipped, and to take the lamb and to say that you're slaughtering it was pretty risky. Circumcision is also a risky type of surgery if you're an adult. And there's no anesthetic. In those days, he would have to do it without anesthesia. It was a risky venture. And to do that, because God said so, that would give them something. We did something to earn our freedom. And when you earn the freedom, you appreciate it. Both presidents pardoned a whole bunch of people. I wonder how they feel about the pardon, because if they really deserve the pardon, then they could feel good about it. But if they didn't deserve it, if they're really serious people, they would feel very uncomfortable that they got out in spite of the fact that they didn't deserve to get out. But that's the human condition. We have to feel that we're worthy of what was given to us. And that's true about everything in life. If God gives us good health, if God gives us prosperity, if God gives us whatever He gives us, we want to always attach it to something that we did that is good and say, we deserved it because we did something for it. We're not just getting a handout. That's one of the things that in society, when we have people who are constantly getting handouts from the government, and people think it's a great thing. It's not a great thing. It's a necessary thing, unfortunately, but it's not a great thing because these people can never really feel whole because they're not really earning what they're getting. Just want to add one more thing. The holiday that we celebrate, the Exodus, is called Pesach. And it's always translated into English as Passover. Why is it called Passover? Because God passed over the homes of the Israelites when He killed all the firstborn Egyptians. So any Jewish home was passed over. But Rashi, the great commentator, says that there's another translation of the word Pesach. It means compassion. But the two explanations are connected. Because what does it mean that God passed over? God doesn't have to, God is not physical. And God doesn't have to pass over something. If God wants a plague to affect people in this home, it affects them. If He doesn't want it to affect in that home, it doesn't affect them. Passing over has a deeper meaning. When someone is deserving of being helped, that's one thing. But if they're not deserving, Justice demands that they don't get the help. But compassion says, you know what, I'm going to pass over my sense of justice. That's like a judge. Someone comes to the court, a teenager is accused of some type of a crime. The teenager deserves to be put in prison for 3 years. And the judge realizes, you know what, this kid is essentially a good kid. He has a future. If he's not going to spend time in jail, he'll learn how to commit more crimes from... I'm going to have compassion, and I'm going to tell him that he's not going to go to jail, that he has to certain requirements, he has to get some counseling and this and that. And he passes over his sense of justice. Because justice says you did the crime, you do the time, as they say. And the judge says, no, I have compassion. Compassion is not forgetting about the justice, it's passing over it. You're aware of the justice and you know that it's the right thing, but in this case, I'm passing over. Again, the people did not all deserve to be liberated. They were not all righteous people. But God passed over, not physically passing over a house. He says, I'm going to overlook their own deficiencies, their own lack, their own iniquity. I'm going to pass over it, and that's what compassion is. So the word Pesach has two meanings. It means pass over and it means compassion, but they're really identical. They're synonymous. Because when you have compassion to someone, it means that you are passing over the sense of justice. And when we deal with it, I said before there were 7 emotional traits. I mentioned the first is kindness. Compassion is not kindness. Kindness is when I do something for someone and I'm not thinking about judgment. I'm just want to be nice to everyone. So I'm nice. Someone comes over, a drug addict, and says, give me $1 or give me $10, whatever, and you give it to him, and he's going to use it for drugs. Kindness doesn't care. If you're just a pure, kind person, you'll just give. You can't say no. That's not always good. Then there's the person who's very judgmental and says will not give anyone anything. That's the other extreme. Then there's the third level, which is the composite of the first two. You're aware of the person's problem. You're not just giving them what you see this drug addict, you're not going to give him the $1 that he's asking for. Instead, you'll buy him a sandwich and give it to him. Or you'll find some other way of not giving in to his request, but you have compassion, which is deeper than kindness. Kindness could sometimes be a problem. Judgment could be a problem. If you're too judgmental, if you're too strict, it could be a problem. But when you have compassion, means you are, in a way, aware of the need to be judgmental, but you're able to pass over it. And that's what happened at the Exodus. Okay, any questions? Any questions on Zoom?
Can I ask you one?
Sure.
How long were the Jews in Egypt?
210 years. In the Torah it says that God told Abraham that his children will be in exile for 400 years. But that was shortened to 210. Why was it shortened? Because God did not say how bad it would be. When the Egyptians tortured the people in ways that went way beyond what God had promised, God just says they're going to be slaves in a foreign land. Slaves doesn't necessarily mean they'll be tortured mercilessly. So that made up. So they went out on about half of the time that it was preordained.
Can I just ask you, were the Jews affected by the first 7 plagues? Because you said the 8th.
Okay, it's not clear from the Torah. The Torah doesn't mention anything about the first 3 plagues, whether it affected the Jews or not. Some commentators say it did affect the Jews, and the purpose of the plagues was just to show God's hand, and the Jews also had to see it. Some commentators say, no, it didn't affect them. But the only time the Torah tells you that it didn't affect the Jews was the fourth and fifth plagues. Those are the ones that, and all the other plagues except for the first three. I just mentioned about God promised Abraham that his children will be slaves. So the question is asked, why would God punish the Egyptians? If God says, you are going to be a slave in this place, and these people are going to enslave you and harm you, then if God predicted that already, why would they be punished? God said that it's going to happen. Why would he punish if God ordained that if God comes and says that you're going to hit the other person, doesn't that mean that you have to do it because God said that? So there are many answers to that question. One answer Maimonides gives is that God didn't say who should do it. God never said Mr. Jones is going to be the tormentor of the Jewish people. He said it's going to happen in Egypt. If you choose to be God's instrument to harm someone, then it's your evil. Because God has his own ways. He can accomplish what he wants to accomplish. If he told you personally, you have to do it, you have to be the executioner, well, if God tells you to do it, you have no choice. But God didn't tell any individual to do it. Another answer given is that they went overboard. Went overboard. You know, in the ancient Israel, when the courts would have corporal punishment, they would have to whip people for certain transgressions. They chose people who were smart and not strong. The person who has to be the executioner or the one who beats you, shouldn't relish it. It shouldn't be someone who really gets into it. I remember when capital punishment was restored in Nevada, there was a guy, Gary Gilmore, maybe some of you remember, who was sentenced to death. There were a whole bunch of people who volunteered to be the executioner. That bothered me. Even if you're for the death penalty, why would you want to volunteer for it? Let the court draft you to do it, but don't volunteer for it. People should volunteer for acts of kindness. So sometimes acts of judgment, of punishment is necessary, but that shouldn't be our desire. And the Egyptians just relished doing what they did to torture the Jews. And that's why they were punished. Even though God preordained that would happen, they didn't have to really enjoy it that much and put their whole heart and soul in it.